Military history of ancient Greece redirects here. Warfare occurred throughout the history of ancient Greece, from the Greek Dark Ages on. The Greek Dark Age drew to a close as a significant increase in population allowed urbanized culture to be restored, which led to the rise of the city-states. These developments ushered in the Archaic period. They also restored the capability of organized warfare between these polis. The fractious nature of ancient Greek society seems to have made of continuous conflict on this larger scale inevitable. Along with the rise of the city-state evolved a new style of warfare, the Hoplite Phalanx. Hoplites were armored infantrymen, armed with spear and shield, and the phalanx was a formation of these soldiers with their shields locked together and spears pointed forward. The Chigivas, dated to around 650 BC, is the earliest depiction of a hoplite in full battle array. With this evolution in warfare, battles seem to have consisted mostly of the clash of hoplite phalanxes from the city-states in conflict. Since the soldiers were citizens with other occupations, warfare was limited in distance, season and scale. Neither side could afford heavy casualties or sustained campaigns, so conflicts seem to have been resolved by a single set-piece battle. The scale and scope of warfare in ancient Greece changed dramatically as a result of the Greco-Persian Wars. To fight the enormous armies of the Achaemenid Empire was effectively beyond the capabilities of a single city-state. The eventual triumph of the Greeks was achieved by alliances of many city-states, on a scale never seen before. The rise of Athens and Sparta during this conflict led directly to the Peloponnesian War, which saw diversification of warfare. Emphasis shifted to naval battles and strategies of attrition such as blockades and sieges. Following the defeat of the Athenians in 404 BC, and the disbandment of the Athenian-dominated Delian League, ancient Greece fell under the Spartan hegemony. But this was unstable, and the Persian Empire sponsored a rebellion by the combined powers of Athens, Thebes, Corinth and Argos, resulting in the Corinthian War. Persia switched sides, which ended the war, in return for the cities of Ionia and Spartan non-interference in Asia Minor. The Spartan hegemony would last another 16 years, until, at the Battle of Leuctra, the Spartans were decisively defeated by the Theban general Epaminondas. The Thebans acted with alacrity to establish a hegemony of their own over Greece. However, Thebes lacked sufficient manpower and resources, and became overstretched. Following the death of Epaminondas and loss of manpower at the Battle of Mantinea, the Theban hegemony ceased. The losses in the 10 years of the Theban hegemony left all the Greek city-states weakened and divided. The city-states of southern Greece were too weak to resist the rise of the Macedonian kingdom in the north. With revolutionary tactics, King Philip II brought most of Greece under his sway, paving the way for the conquest of the known world by his son Alexander the Great. The rise of the Macedonian kingdom is generally taken to signal the end of the Greek classical period, and certainly marked the end of the distinctive hoplite battle in ancient Greece. Military structure and methods in ancient Greece. Hoplite, along with the rise of the city-state, evolved a new style of warfare and the emergence of the hoplite. The hoplite was an infantryman, the central element of warfare in ancient Greece. The word hoplite derives from hoplon, meaning an item of armor or equipment. Thus, hoplite may approximate to armored man. Hoplites were the citizen soldiers of the ancient Greek city-states. They were primarily armed as spearmen and fought in a phalanx. Hoplite armor was extremely expensive for the average citizen, so it was commonly passed down from the soldier's father or relative. Alexander's Macedonian army had spears called sarissas that were 18 feet long, far longer than the 6 to 9 foot Greek dory. The secondary weapon of a hoplite was the xiphos, a short sword used when the soldier's spear was broken or lost while fighting. The origins of the hoplite are obscure, and no small matter of contention amongst historians. Traditionally, this has been dated to the 8th century BC, and attributed to Sparta, but more recent views suggest a later date. towards the 7th century BC. Certainly, by approximately 650 BC, as dated by the Chijivas, the Hoplite revolution was complete. The major innovation in the development of the hoplite seems to have been the characteristic circular shield, roughly 1 meter in diameter, and made of wood faced with bronze. Although very heavy, the design of this shield was such that it could be supported on the shoulder. More importantly, it permitted the formation of a shield wall by an army, an impenetrable mass of men and shields. Men were also equipped with metal greaves and also a breastplate made of bronze, leather, or stiff cloth. When this was combined with the primary weapon of the hoplite, 2 to 3 meters long spear, it gave both offensive and defensive capabilities. Regardless of where it developed, the model for the hoplite army evidently quickly spread throughout Greece. The persuasive qualities of the phalanx were probably its relative simplicity, low fatality rate, and relatively low cost. The phalanx also became a source of political influence because men had to provide their own equipment in order to be a part of the army. The hoplite phalanx. The ancient Greek city-states developed a military formation called the phalanx, which were rows of shoulder-to-shoulder hoplites. The hoplites would lock their shields together, and the first few ranks of soldiers would project their spears out over the first rank of shields. The phalanx therefore presented a shield wall and a massive spear points to the enemy, making frontal assaults much more difficult. It also allowed a higher proportion of the soldiers to be actively engaged in combat at a given time. The phalanx formed the core of ancient Greek militaries. Because hoplites were all protected by their own shield and others' shields and spears, they were relatively safe as long as the formation didn't break. When advancing towards an enemy, the phalanx would break into a run that was sufficient to create momentum but not too much as to lose cohesion. The opposing sides would collide viciously, possibly terrifying many of the hoplites of the front row. The battle would then rely on the valor of the men in the front line, while those in the rear maintained forward pressure on the front ranks with their shields. When in combat, the whole formation would consistently press forward trying to break the enemy formation. Thus, when two phalanx formations engaged, the struggle essentially became a pushing match, in which, as a rule, the deeper phalanx would almost always win, with few recorded exceptions. When exactly the phalanx developed is uncertain, but it is thought to have been developed by the Spartans. The Chijivas, dated to around 650 BC, is the earliest depiction of a hoplite in full battle array. The hoplite was a well-armed and armored citizen soldier primarily drawn from the middle classes. Every man had to serve at least 2 years in the army. Fighting in the tight phalanx formation maximized the effectiveness of his armor, large shield and long spear, presenting a wall of armor and spear points to the enemy. They were a force to be reckoned with. Hoplite warfare, at least in the archaic period, the fragmentary nature of ancient Greece, with many competing city-states, increased the frequency of conflict, but conversely limited the scale of warfare. Unable to maintain professional armies, the city-states relied on their own citizens to fight. This inevitably reduced the potential duration of campaigns, as citizens would need to return to their own professions. Campaigns would therefore often be restricted to summer. Armies marched directly to their target, possibly agreed on by the protagonists. If battle was refused by one side, they would retreat to the city, in which case the attackers generally had to content themselves with ravaging the countryside around, since siegecraft was undeveloped. When battles occurred, they were usually set piece and intended to be decisive. The battlefield would be flat and open, reducing the possibilities for complex tactical maneuvers. These battles were short, bloody, and brutal, and thus required a high degree of discipline. At least in the early classical period, other troops were less important, generally protected the flanks, when present at all, and both light infantry and missile troops were negligible. The strength of hoplites was shock combat. The two phalanxes would smash into each other in hopes of breaking or encircling the enemy forces' line. Failing that, a battle degenerated into a pushing match, with the men in the rear trying to force the front lines through those of the enemy. This maneuver was known as the Athismos. Battles rarely lasted more than an hour. Once one of the lines broke, the troops would generally flee from the field, sometimes chased by peltasts or light cavalry. If a hoplite escaped, he would sometimes be forced to drop his cumbersome aspish, thereby disgracing himself to his friends and family. Casualties were slight compared to later battles, rarely amounting to more than 5% of the losing side. But the slain often included the most prominent citizens and generals who led from the front. Thus, the whole war could be decided by a single field battle. Victory was enforced by ransoming the fallen back to the defeated, called the custom of the dead Greeks. Other elements of Greek armies also included light infantry, including simple javelin throwers, the more armored peltasts, and cavalry to scout and drive off skirmishes. However, the rarity of horses made them far more expensive than armor, limiting cavalrymen to nobles and the very wealthy. Perhaps the most famous type of Greek cavalry was Tarentine cavalry, originating from the city-state of Taras in Magna Graecia. Some city-states also employed tactics using slingers and archers for longer-range skirmishing power. The economics of ancient warfare. Campaigns were often timed with the agricultural season so as to impact the enemy's crops and harvest. The timing had to be very carefully arranged so that the invader's enemy's harvest would be disrupted but the invader's harvest would not be affected. Late invasions were also possible in the hopes that the sowing season would be affected, but this at best would have minimal effects on the harvest. One alternative to disrupting the harvest was to ravage the countryside by uprooting trees, burning houses and crops and killing all who were not safe behind the walls of the city. Ravaging the countryside cost much effort and was also dependent on the season because green crops do not burn as well as those nearer to harvest, which are more dry. War also led to acquisition of land and slaves, which would lead to a greater harvest, which could support a larger army. Plunder was also a large part of war, and this allowed for pressure to be taken off of the government finances and allowed for investments to be made that would strengthen the polis. War also stimulated production because of the sudden increase in demand for weapons and armor. Shipbuilders would also experience sudden increases in the production demands.